Have you ever put your heart and soul into something, only to watch someone casually throw it in the trash? That's exactly what happened to me, but with a twist you won't believe. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. I still remember the first time I cooked for my future in-laws. Mark and I had been dating for almost a year, and meeting his parents felt like the natural next step. He'd warned me that his mother could be particular, but I brushed it off. Everyone thinks their mother is difficult, right? I spent 3 days planning the perfect menu. Mark mentioned his mom loved Italian food, so I decided on my grandmother's lasagna recipe, the one that had won over even my pickiest friends. I wanted everything to be perfect. The house spotless, the table set with the good dishes we'd been saving, candles lit, wine breathing. When they arrived, his father, Bill, was warm and friendly, immediately complimenting our home and bringing a bottle of wine. His mother, Patricia, walked in behind him with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She scanned our living room slowly, like she was conducting an inspection. "What a cozy place you have," she said, emphasizing the word cozy, in a way that made it sound like she meant cramped. I felt my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. First impressions are always awkward, I told myself. The evening started pleasantly enough. Small talk flowed over appetizers, with Patricia occasionally asking pointed questions about my family background and career. I noticed she barely touched the bruschetta I'd made, but I figured she was saving room for the main course. When I brought out the lasagna, I couldn't help but feel a flutter of pride. It looked perfect, bubbling cheese, the aroma of herbs filling the dining room. Mark squeezed my hand under the table. "This looks wonderful, honey," he whispered. I served everyone, watching anxiously as Patricia took her first bite. She chewed slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she placed her fork down carefully beside her plate. "It's interesting," she said, dabbing at her lips with her napkin. "A bit heavy on the garlic for my taste. And is that pre-grated cheese? I find freshly grated Parmigiano Reggiano makes such a difference." I felt my cheeks flush. "Actually, I grated it myself. It's a family recipe." She nodded, taking a small sip of water. "Well, everyone has their own way of doing things, I suppose." The conversation moved on, but I noticed Patricia only took 2 more small bites throughout the entire meal. She pushed the food around her plate, occasionally bringing an empty fork to her lips while engaging Bill in conversation about their recent cruise. Mark and his father ate enthusiastically, both going for seconds. Bill even called across the table, "Patricia, you're missing out." "This is fantastic." She just smiled tightly and complimented the table setting instead. After dessert, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. When I returned, I overheard Patricia telling Mark, "She seems nice enough, but cooking isn't her strong suit, is it? Don't worry, I'll teach her a few things." I froze in the doorway, coffee pot in hand. Mark looked mortified. "Mom, that's not—" he started, but stopped when he saw me standing there. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. As they were leaving, Patricia hugged me stiffly and said, "Next time, I'll bring one of my casseroles to show you how it's done properly." After they left, Mark apologized profusely. "She's just like that," he said, pulling me close. "She means well, but she can be critical." The lasagna was amazing. I tried to laugh it off, but something felt off. The next morning, while cleaning up the remaining dishes, I noticed something strange. The trash can was fuller than it should have been. When I looked closer, I found almost all of Patricia's lasagna hidden beneath napkins. She hadn't just disliked my cooking, she'd thrown it away when no one was looking. "It's fine," I told Mark when he asked why I seemed upset. "Just first meeting jitters." But it wasn't fine. What I didn't know then was that this dinner would set the pattern for the next 3 years of my life. The second time Patricia came over, I made roast chicken with all the trimmings. I'd practiced twice beforehand, perfecting the recipe. This time, I caught her scraping most of her plate into the garbage when she thought no one was watching. The third time, she brought her own container of food, claiming she had dietary restrictions she'd somehow never mentioned before. By the fourth visit, Mark and I were engaged, and Patricia had established herself as the authority on everything in our relationship, especially my cooking. Every dish I prepared was either too spicy, too bland, overcooked, or undercooked. Nothing ever met her standards. Mark tried to mediate at first. "Mom, give her a break," he'd say. But Patricia would just smile sadly, as if he was defending me out of pity rather than justice. "I'm only trying to help," she'd reply. "When you were growing up, you loved my cooking. I just want to make sure she knows what you like." The more serious Mark and I became, the more Patricia inserted herself into our lives. Wedding planning became a battlefield, with every decision scrutinized and second-guessed. But nothing compared to her ongoing campaign against my cooking. I tried everything: cooking classes, new recipes, even attempting to recreate Patricia's own dishes. Nothing worked. If it came from my kitchen, it wasn't good enough. One night, after a particularly exhausting dinner where Patricia had brought an entire backup meal because she wasn't sure what I was making would agree with her, I asked Mark a question that had been burning in my mind. "Does your mom hate me, or is it just my cooking?" He sighed, running his hands through his hair. "She's always been like this. She did the same thing to my sister's husband. It's her way of marking her territory, I guess. So I'm just supposed to put up with it? Forever?" "She'll warm up eventually," he promised, but I could see in his eyes that even he didn't believe it. Little did I know, things were about to get much, much worse. 6 months after that first dinner, Mark proposed. Despite my reservations about his mother, I said yes without hesitation. I loved him, and I believed we could work through the Patricia situation together. Mark suggested we have a special lunch to discuss wedding plans. Just the four of us. I thought it was a perfect opportunity to try again with Patricia. Maybe, I reasoned, if I showed her I valued her input on the wedding, she might finally accept me. I decided to prepare something foolproof. A beautiful Mediterranean spread with grilled chicken, homemade hummus, fresh pita, and a colorful Greek salad. I'd seen Patricia eat similar food at a restaurant once, so I knew she didn't dislike it on principle. The morning of the lunch, I woke up early to make everything from scratch. The hummus was silky smooth with just the right amount of garlic and tahini. The chicken was marinated overnight in lemon, olive oil, and herbs. The pita bread came out of the oven perfectly puffed and golden. When they arrived, Patricia carried a large tote bag. "I brought some wedding magazines," she explained, but I noticed the bag looked heavier than a few magazines would warrant. Bill admired the spread immediately. "This looks fantastic. Did you make all this yourself?" Before I could answer, Patricia cut in. "It does look colorful, doesn't it? Mark, remember that little bistro we went to in Greece during our family vacation? Now that was authentic Mediterranean food." Mark gave me an apologetic look. "This looks amazing, honey. I'm starving." We sat down, and I served everyone. Bill and Mark dug in enthusiastically, but Patricia just picked at her food, taking tiny bites and pushing things around her plate. "Aren't you hungry, Mom?" Mark asked. "Oh, I had a late breakfast," she said dismissively. Now, about the venue. I took the liberty of calling Westfield Country Club. They had a cancellation for next June, and I put down a deposit to hold the date. I nearly choked on my water. "You what?" "It's the perfect venue," Patricia continued as if she hadn't heard me. "They have that beautiful ballroom, and the gardens will be in full bloom for photos." Mark looked at me, then back at his mother. "Mom, we haven't even discussed dates or venues yet. We might want something different." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry, it's refundable. But trust me, you won't find anything better. I got married there, and so did your sister. I took a deep breath. Patricia, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but Mark and I might want something that reflects both of our tastes. Maybe something a bit more relaxed? She looked at me like I'd suggested getting married in a barn, which, honestly, I had been considering. Relaxed? This is a wedding, not a backyard barbecue. The conversation spiraled from there. Every time I offered an idea, a smaller guest list, a less traditional dress, a honeymoon that wasn't a European cruise, Patricia had a reason why it wouldn't work. By the time we got to dessert, a homemade baklava I'd spent hours layering, I was exhausted. She took one bite, declared it interesting, and then launched into why ivory was a better choice than pure white for my dress since white isn't flattering on everyone. After they left, I went to clear the table and noticed Patricia's plate. She'd eaten maybe 2 bites of everything. I sighed and scraped the food into the trash. But something caught my eye. The trash can was already fuller than it should have been. Beneath some napkins, I found a plastic container from an upscale deli downtown. Inside were the remnants of a chicken salad sandwich. She had brought her own lunch. She'd come to our wedding planning meal having already eaten. When Mark came into the kitchen, I showed him the container. Your mother brought her own food to our lunch. He looked uncomfortable. Maybe she wasn't sure what you were making. Mark, she knew exactly what I was making. I sent the menu to both your parents last week. I could feel angry tears forming. She didn't even try. She just decided beforehand that my food wasn't good enough. I'll talk to her, he promised. No, I said, surprising myself. I want to talk to her. This is about us working together on the wedding. If we can't even have a meal together, how are we going to plan anything? The next day, I called Patricia and asked if we could meet for coffee. Just the 2 of us. She sounded surprised, but agreed. At the cafe, I took a deep breath and laid it all out. Patricia, I noticed you brought your own food yesterday, and it hurt my feelings. I put a lot of effort into that meal. She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but recovered quickly. I have certain dietary needs. I didn't want to burden you with them. You could have told me. I would have accommodated anything. Well, she said, stirring her coffee, the truth is, I'm just particular about food. It's nothing personal. But the way she wouldn't meet my eyes told me it was very personal indeed. I want us to have a good relationship, I said. For Mark's sake, but also for mine. This wedding is important to both of us, and I'd like your input. But as an advisor, not the decision maker. She smiled thinly. Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best. I should have known then that nothing would change. 2 days later, Mark called me, excited. Mom found the perfect caterer. They can give us a family discount since they did my cousin's wedding last year. And just like that, Patricia had taken over the first major wedding decision without even consulting me. I realized then that the lunch had never been about planning our wedding together. It had been about Patricia establishing who was really in charge. And in her mind, it certainly wasn't me. Despite the tension with Patricia, Mark and I had a beautiful wedding. I compromised on some things. Yes to the country club, no to the 12-tiered cake she wanted, and somehow we made it through. The day itself was magical, even with Patricia making last-minute adjustments to my carefully planned table settings. The honeymoon was blissful. 2 weeks in Greece, ironically inspired by that Mediterranean lunch I'd made. For 14 days, I didn't have to think about Patricia or her opinions on my cooking. Mark and I ate fresh seafood by the ocean, learned to make authentic moussaka in a local's kitchen, and drank wine under the stars. It was perfect. But reality has a way of crashing back in. 3 days after we returned, still jet-lagged and glowing from our trip, Mark got a call from his mother. "Wonderful news," he said, hanging up. "Mom and Dad are moving." My heart sank. Moving where? They found a house just a few blocks away. Isn't that great? Mom says it'll be so much easier for family dinners and holidays. I tried to smile, but my face felt frozen. When did they decide this? While we were gone, apparently. Mom says it was a spur-of-the-moment thing. The house came on the market, and they jumped on it. Spur of the moment. Right. Nothing Patricia did was spontaneous. This was calculated. "Aren't they happy in their current house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "They've been there for 20 years. Mark shrugged. "Mom said they've been thinking about downsizing anyway. And this way, they can be close to us for when we start a family." When we start a family. The thought of Patricia being involved in raising our hypothetical children made my stomach tighten. 2 weeks later, they moved in. 3 blocks away, a 5-minute walk. Patricia wasted no time making her presence known. The first time she showed up unannounced, I was making dinner. The doorbell rang, and there she stood with a casserole dish. "I thought you might need something for dinner," she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. "You two must be so busy settling in after the wedding." I looked at the half-chopped vegetables on my cutting board, the chicken already marinating in the fridge. "Actually, I'm making dinner right now," I said, gesturing to my preparations. Patricia glanced at the cutting board and frowned slightly. "Well, I'll just leave this anyway. You can have it tomorrow." She opened our refrigerator, and rearranged things to make room for her casserole. Then she leaned over to inspect what I was making. "Stir-fry?" she asked, her tone making it sound like I'd said roadkill. "Thai basil chicken," I corrected. Mark never liked spicy food growing up." "He loves it now," I said, perhaps a bit sharply. "He ordered it 3 times in Greece." "Well, people's tastes change, I suppose," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it for a second. "Anyway, I won't keep you. We're having a little neighborhood get-together this weekend, just a casual dinner to meet the neighbors. Saturday at 6. After she left, I looked at the casserole she'd brought. Some kind of tuna noodle thing that wasn't even warm anymore. When Mark got home, I showed it to him. He sighed. "That's just her way of helping." "It doesn't feel like help, Mark. It feels like criticism." The pattern continued. Patricia would drop by unannounced, always around dinner time. She'd peer into pots, offer unsolicited advice, and make comments about Mark's childhood preferences. "Mark always hated onions," she'd say, watching me dice them. "And he needs protein to feel full. Is that all the meat you're using?" What drove me crazy was that Mark did like onions. He loved them. Just like he loved spicy food and curry and all the other things Patricia claimed he hated. When I pointed this out, he would shrug and say, "I guess my tastes changed." But Patricia wasn't just invading our kitchen. After the neighborhood get-together, which turned out to be an elaborate dinner party where she introduced us to everyone as my son and his new wife, she began involving herself in every aspect of our lives. She had opinions on our furniture, our paint colors, our weekend plans, and always, my cooking. One evening, after Patricia's 3rd visit that week, I reached my breaking point. She'd brought over another casserole despite my texts explicitly saying we had dinner plans. "Oh, I just thought you might want something home-cooked," she said, ignoring the fact that I was literally in the middle of cooking. After she left, I turned to Mark. "This can't continue. I feel like I'm being inspected in my own home." "She's just trying to be close to us," he said, but I could tell even he was finding her constant presence exhausting. "Mark, she brought food over even after I told her not to. She's not respecting our boundaries." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll talk to her. He did talk to her, and for a blissful week, Patricia kept her distance. But then came Sunday dinner, a standing invitation we couldn't refuse without major drama. I decided to bring dessert, a pear and almond tart that had taken me hours to perfect. When I presented it after dinner, Patricia looked at it and smiled thinly. "How lovely," she said, cutting herself a tiny sliver. "Though I find pears can be a bit grainy in baked goods. And is that cinnamon I taste?" "Mark is allergic to cinnamon." Mark froze mid-bite. "I'm not allergic to cinnamon, Mom." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Well, maybe not allergic, but you always got headaches from it as a child." "I don't remember that at all," Mark said, clearly confused. "A mother remembers these things," Patricia said firmly, as if that settled it. Later, as we were cleaning up, I found my tart in the trash, barely touched. Patricia hadn't even bothered to hide it this time. When I showed Mark, something changed in his expression. For the first time, he seemed to truly see what was happening. "This isn't about the food, is it?" he asked quietly. "No," I replied. "It never was." After the tart incident, Mark promised he would set firmer boundaries with his mother. For a while, things improved slightly. Patricia still dropped by unannounced, but less frequently. She still made comments about my cooking, but Mark would gently correct her. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Then came Thanksgiving, our first major holiday as a married couple. "I'd like to host Thanksgiving this year," I told Mark one evening in early November. "I've always dreamed of having my own Thanksgiving dinner, with all the traditional dishes, plus a few of my family's recipes." Mark looked hesitant. "Mom always hosts Thanksgiving. It's kind of her thing." "I know, but we're married now. Shouldn't we start our own traditions?" I reached for his hand. "We could invite your parents, my parents, maybe your sister and her husband. Nothing too big, but it would be special." After some discussion, Mark agreed. When he called Patricia to break the news, I could hear her protest through the phone. But surprisingly, she eventually acquiesced. "She says it's fine," Mark said, hanging up. "She'll even bring her famous cranberry sauce." I spent weeks planning the perfect Thanksgiving menu. I ordered an organic turkey, tested stuffing recipes, and practiced my grandmother's secret sweet potato casserole. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, bought new table linens, and even ordered a centerpiece from the best florist in town. The day before Thanksgiving, I baked 3 pies, pumpkin, pecan, and apple, and prepped everything I could in advance. I was exhausted, but excited. This was my chance to show Patricia that I could create a beautiful, delicious holiday meal. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early to get the turkey in the oven. By noon, the house smelled amazing. Roasting turkey, simmering gravy, fresh herbs. I had everything perfectly timed. Guests would arrive at 3, appetizers would be served, dinner at 5. At 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Patricia standing there with Bill, both of them carrying multiple shopping bags and containers. "I thought you might need help," Patricia said, brushing past me into the kitchen. She surveyed my workspace with a critical eye. "Oh dear, you haven't even started the stuffing yet." "I'm making it fresh to go in the oven once the turkey comes out," I explained. She frowned. "That's not how it's done. The stuffing needs to cook inside the bird." "Actually, food safety experts recommend cooking it separately," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It reduces the risk of bacteria." Patricia looked at me like I'd suggested serving raw chicken. "I've been cooking turkeys for 40 years, and no one has ever gotten sick." "Bill, put the stuffing on the counter." Bill, looking uncomfortable, set down a large container of what I assumed was Patricia's stuffing. I noticed he'd brought in several other dishes as well. Mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and what looked like her cranberry sauce, although there was enough to feed 20 people, not the 8 we were expecting. My carefully planned meal was being hijacked before my eyes. Patricia, I appreciate the thought, but I've got everything under control. The only thing we needed was the cranberry sauce you offered to bring. Better safe than sorry, she said cheerfully, opening my refrigerator and rearranging things to make room for her dishes. Now, let me check on that turkey. Before I could stop her, she opened the oven door, letting out precious heat. It looks a bit dry already. Did you baste it? I'm using a different method, I said, my patience wearing thin. It's a butter-soaked cheesecloth technique. It doesn't need basting. Patricia made a dismissive noise. I've never heard of such a thing. Here, let me show you how to properly baste a turkey. Mark chose that moment to walk into the kitchen. He took in the scene, his mother reaching for my turkey, my flushed face, the counter now crowded with her dishes. Mom, he said firmly, what's going on? I'm just helping, Patricia said innocently. Your wife seems a bit overwhelmed. I could see Mark weighing his options, stand up to his mother or try to keep the peace. To my relief, he chose the former. Mom, we've got this under control. Why don't you and Dad relax in the living room? I've got the game on. Patricia looked hurt. I was only trying to help. I know, Mark said, softer now. But this is our first time hosting. We want to do it our way. Reluctantly, Patricia allowed herself to be led to the living room, but not before giving me a look that said this wasn't over. For the next 2 hours, I worked frantically to get everything back on schedule. My pies had been pushed to the back of the refrigerator, one of them slightly crushed by Patricia's green bean casserole. The turkey had lost heat from her opening the oven, and my timing was thrown off. When my parents and Mark's sister arrived at 3, I was still scrambling. Patricia, meanwhile, had positioned herself in the living room like visiting royalty, accepting compliments on the table setting that I had created. I taught her everything she knows. I overheard her telling my mother, as if she'd been mentoring me for years instead of criticizing me at every turn. Despite the setbacks, dinner itself was beautiful. The turkey was perfectly cooked, golden and juicy. My stuffing was light and flavorful, the sweet potatoes caramelized just right. Even the gravy, which Patricia had declared too thin earlier, set up perfectly. As everyone took their seats, I felt a surge of pride. I'd done it, created a beautiful Thanksgiving dinner despite the interference. Then I noticed something strange. On the sideboard sat all of Patricia's dishes, arranged as a complete second Thanksgiving meal. I just put them out as options, she said when Mark questioned her. Some people prefer traditional preparations. Throughout dinner, Patricia made a show of taking tiny portions of my food while heaping her plate with her own dishes. Would anyone like some proper stuffing? She asked. Or some green beans that aren't quite so crisp? By the time we reached dessert, I was emotionally exhausted. When I brought out my 3 homemade pies, Patricia smiled sweetly and produced a 4th from seemingly nowhere. I brought my blue ribbon pumpkin pie, she announced. Just in case. Just in case your pies are inedible, was the clear implication. That night, after everyone had gone and the kitchen was finally clean, I found Mark sitting alone in the dark living room. I'm sorry, he said when I sat beside him. I had no idea she would do that. Didn't you? I asked gently. Hasn't she always done exactly this? Undermine me? Especially when it comes to food? He was quiet for a long moment. What do you want me to do? I want you to understand that this isn't just about holidays or recipes, or even your mother's rudeness. This is about respect. She doesn't respect me or our marriage. I'll talk to her, he promised. But we both knew talking hadn't worked before. And as I would soon discover, the holiday takeover was just the beginning of Patricia's escalating campaign against my cooking. And against me. After the Thanksgiving disaster, I tried to maintain some distance from Patricia. I politely declined her invitations to lunch, ignored her texts asking what we were having for dinner, and suggested to Mark that maybe we should spend Christmas with my family instead. But avoidance is hard when someone lives 3 blocks away and has decided that boundaries don't apply to them. By mid-December, Patricia was back to her usual routine of dropping by unannounced, usually around dinner time. I'd started keeping the door locked, pretending we weren't home when she knocked. It was childish, perhaps, but it was the only defense I had. One evening, when Mark was working late, I was experimenting with a new recipe, a complex French cassoulet that required hours of preparation. I'd been researching authentic techniques for weeks, sourced special ingredients, and was feeling genuinely excited about cooking again. The kitchen smelled amazing, rich with garlic, herbs, and slow-cooked duck. I'd just pulled the dish from the oven to add the final layer of breadcrumbs when I heard a key in the front door. Mark wasn't due home for hours. There was only one other person who had a key. "Hello? Anyone home?" Patricia's voice rang out from the hallway. I froze, horrified. "Patricia? How did you get in?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway, waving a key. "Mark gave me this for emergencies. I tried calling, but you didn't answer, so I got worried." There had been no calls. I'd checked my phone minutes earlier. This was a lie, and we both knew it. "As you can see, there's no emergency," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just making dinner." Patricia peered at my cassoulet with obvious skepticism. "What on earth is that? It looks like... Well, I'm not sure what it looks like." "It's cassoulet, a French dish." She wrinkled her nose. "It smells very... garlicky. Mark doesn't like too much garlic." "Actually, he does," I said firmly. "He's the one who requested this dish." It was a small lie. Mark hadn't specifically asked for cassoulet, but he did love garlic, and he'd been supportive of my culinary experiments. Patricia didn't respond. Instead, she walked over to the pot and, without asking, took a spoon from my drawer and dipped it into my carefully prepared dish. "Patricia," I protested, but she was already tasting it. She made a face. "Oh my, that's very... rich and salty. Is it supposed to be this salty?" It wasn't salty at all. The seasoning was perfect. "Yes, it's supposed to taste exactly like this," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish preparing dinner for my husband." I emphasized the words, "my husband," in a way that wasn't subtle. Patricia ignored me. "You know, I was just thinking that Mark has seemed a bit under the weather lately. He mentioned an upset stomach the other day. I wonder if it's the food." My blood began to boil. "Are you suggesting I'm making Mark sick?" She held up her hands in mock surrender. "I'm not suggesting anything. I just know that some of these exotic recipes can be hard on a sensitive system. Mark has always had a delicate stomach. Plain, simple food is best for him." "Mark does not have a delicate stomach," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "He eats everything. He loves trying new foods. In fact, he's the one who encouraged me to expand my cooking repertoire." Patricia smiled that infuriating smile, the one that said she knew better than me about her son, about cooking, about everything. "Well, mothers know these things," she said. "I raised him after all." I took a deep breath, trying to remind myself that causing a scene would only make things worse. "Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but I need to finish dinner. Mark will be home late, and I want this to be ready." She didn't move. Instead, she looked pointedly at the cassoulet. "You know, I brought over a nice chicken casserole. It's in my car. Much more suitable for a weeknight dinner. Let me go get it." Before I could respond, she was heading for the front door. I stood there, stunned. Was she seriously suggesting I abandon my hours of work to serve her casserole instead? She returned moments later with a glass baking dish covered in foil. Here we are. Much better than that heavy foreign dish. This is the kind of food Mark grew up on. She set her casserole on the counter and then did something I still can't believe. She picked up my cassoulet, the dish I'd spent all day preparing, and started walking toward the trash can. "What are you doing?" I gasped. "Making room," she said simply. "You don't need both dishes, and mine is already cooked." I lunged forward and grabbed the pot from her hands, barely managing to keep it from spilling. "Are you insane? You can't just throw away food I've prepared." For a brief moment, Patricia looked genuinely surprised, as if she couldn't fathom why I was upset. Then her expression hardened. "I'm just trying to help. That, whatever it is, doesn't look appetizing at all. Mark won't eat that." "Yes, he will," I insisted. "He loves my cooking. He has always loved my cooking." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Let's be honest here. We both know your cooking isn't up to standard. I've been polite about it, but frankly, I'm worried about Mark's health. These elaborate concoctions, all these foreign spices, it's not good for him." I stood there, speechless. After all this time, all these months of subtle sabotage and passive-aggressive comments, she was finally saying it outright. "You've been throwing my food away since the first time you came to our house," I said quietly. "You've been undermining me at every turn. Why? What have I ever done to you except love your son?" For a moment, I thought I saw something like guilt flicker across her face, but it was quickly replaced by indignation. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said stiffly. "I've only ever tried to help." "Is that what you call this?" I gestured to the cassoulet she'd nearly dumped. "Helping?" "I call it looking out for my son's well-being," she replied. "Someone has to make sure he's properly taken care of." The implication was clear. She didn't think I was taking care of him properly. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Get out of my house and give me back that key." Patricia drew herself up, offended. "I most certainly will not. Mark gave me that key." "Then I'll change the locks tomorrow," I threatened. "Either way, you are never walking into my house uninvited again." We stood there at an impasse, neither willing to back down. The silence was broken by the sound of the front door opening. Mark was home early. He took in the scene. Me standing protectively in front of my cassoulet, his mother with her casserole, both of us red-faced and angry. "What's going on?" he asked cautiously. Patricia immediately burst into tears. "Your wife is throwing me out. I was just trying to help with dinner, and she completely overreacted." Mark looked at me, confusion and disappointment on his face. "Seriously? You're kicking my mother out?" In that moment, I realized we had reached a breaking point. Not just with Patricia, but with my marriage. Because if Mark couldn't see what was happening right in front of him, what hope did we have? The fallout from the kitchen incident was worse than I could have imagined. Mark, faced with his crying mother and my fury, tried to mediate on the spot. "Mom, why don't you sit down in the living room?" he said gently. "Let me talk to Sarah for a minute." Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd produced from nowhere. "I was only trying to help. I don't understand why she's so sensitive about everything." Once Patricia was out of earshot, Mark turned to me with pleading eyes. "What happened? Mom says you just flipped out on her." I explained everything. The unexpected entry with a key we hadn't given her, her attempt to throw away my cassoulet, her insistence that I was somehow making him sick with my cooking. "She tried to throw your food in the trash?" Mark asked, looking genuinely shocked. Yes, I said firmly. And it's not the first time. Mark, your mother has been throwing away my food since the first dinner I cooked for her. She's been undermining me at every turn. He rubbed his face, looking exhausted. I find it hard to believe she'd just throw away food you'd made. There must be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I insisted. She had my cassoulet in her hands, headed for the garbage can. If I hadn't stopped her, it would be in the trash right now. Mark looked torn. Let me talk to her. I'm sure we can sort this out. But sorting it out seemed impossible. When Mark confronted his mother, she denied everything. The key? Mark had given it to her years ago for emergencies. The cassoulet? She was just moving it to make room for her casserole, not throwing it away. My accusations were all a misunderstanding or an outright fabrication. Your wife has always had a problem with me, Patricia said tearfully. Nothing I do is ever good enough. I try to help, and she treats me like I'm interfering. Because you are interfering, I said, unable to contain myself. You show up uninvited, criticize everything I cook, and try to replace it with your own food. That's the definition of interference. Patricia turned to Mark with wounded eyes. See how she talks to me? In my day, daughters-in-law respected their husbands' mothers. The evening ended in an uncomfortable standoff. Patricia left with her casserole, shooting me a look of pure venom when Mark wasn't watching. I served the cassoulet, which was perfect despite the drama. But neither of us enjoyed it. There was too much tension in the air. Later that night, Mark and I had our first real fight as a married couple. You need to change the locks, I insisted. Your mother can't have unrestricted access to our home. She's my mother, Mark protested. She would never use the key unless it was important. She used it today, and there was no emergency. She lied about calling me. She just wanted to check up on what I was cooking. Mark was silent for a long moment. Maybe if you made more of an effort with her, he finally suggested. She wouldn't feel the need to check up on things. I stared at him, hurt beyond words. So this is my fault? Your mother barges into our home uninvited, tries to throw away my cooking, insults me to my face, and somehow I'm the one who needs to make more effort? That's not what I meant, he backpedaled. I just think both of you could try harder. I have tried, I said, tears springing to my eyes. I've tried so hard, Mark. I've smiled through her criticism, thanked her for unsolicited advice, pretended not to notice when she throws away food I've spent hours making. What more can I possibly do? He didn't have an answer for that. The next day, the family divide became even more apparent. Mark's sister called me, her voice cold. Mom told me what happened, she said without preamble. I can't believe you'd treat her that way after everything she's done for you. What exactly has she done for me? I asked, genuinely curious about what narrative Patricia had spun. She's always trying to help you learn to cook properly, Mark's sister replied. She says you're too proud to take advice, even though Mark is losing weight because he can't eat your cooking. I was stunned. Mark isn't losing weight, and your mother doesn't try to teach me anything. She just criticizes and throws away perfectly good food. That's not how she tells it, Mark's sister said stiffly. Anyway, I just called to say that you owe her an apology. She was in tears all night. After that call, I felt like I was going crazy. Had I imagined everything? Was I really the villain in this story? Then Bill, Mark's father, stopped by. Unlike Patricia, he knocked and waited to be invited in. I wanted to check on you, he said awkwardly once we were seated in the living room. Patricia told me about what happened yesterday. I braced myself for more accusations. And? Bill looked uncomfortable. And? I wanted to say I'm sorry. Patricia can be a bit overwhelming when it comes to her children, especially Mark. I felt a rush of validation. So you believe me? About what she's been doing? I know my wife, he said simply. She's not used to sharing her son with another woman. She did the same thing to Jenny's husband in the beginning. Mark's sister's husband, the one Patricia claimed to have always loved. It got better with time, Bill continued. Once Jenny had kids, Patricia redirected her energy toward the grandchildren. The thought of Patricia treating our future children the way she treated me sent a chill down my spine. How did Jenny's husband cope? I asked. Bill smiled sadly. He didn't, really. He just learned to leave the room when Patricia started in on him. They don't have much of a relationship. That wasn't a future I wanted. Thank you for being honest with me, I said. After Bill left, I sat alone in the house, thinking. The family was now officially divided. Mark's sister and mother on one side, Bill and me on the other, with Mark caught in the middle. That evening, when Mark came home, I made one last attempt to make him understand. Your father visited today, I told him. He confirmed everything I've been saying about your mother. Mark looked surprised. Dad said that? He usually stays out of Mom's situations. Situations? You mean this has happened before? Mark sighed deeply. She and Jenny's husband had some issues early on, but they worked it out. They didn't work it out, I corrected him. According to your father, they barely speak to each other. Is that what you want for us? For me to just silently endure your mother's behavior for the rest of our lives? For the first time, I saw real understanding dawn in Mark's eyes. No, he said quietly. That's not what I want. It was a small victory, but an important one. The family might be divided, but for the first time, I felt like my husband was truly on my side. What I didn't realize was that Patricia, having lost this battle, was about to escalate the war. For the next 2 weeks, Patricia kept her distance. No surprise visits, no unsolicited casseroles, not even a text message to Mark asking what we were having for dinner. On the surface, it seemed like we'd finally established boundaries. Mark had asked for his mother's house key back, a small victory that had taken far too long, and had a long conversation with her about respecting our space. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt uneasy. This silence didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like the calm before a storm. Maybe she's finally understood, Mark suggested hopefully one evening. Dad probably talked to her too. But I knew better. Women like Patricia don't simply accept defeat, especially when it comes to their sons. My suspicions were confirmed when Mark came home from lunch with his parents looking troubled. What's wrong? I asked, immediately noticing his expression. Nothing, he said quickly. Too quickly. Just work stuff. But that night, I heard him on the phone in the bathroom, speaking in hushed tones. When he came back to bed, I pretended to be asleep. Whatever Patricia was plotting, I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next day, I met my friend Jen for coffee. We'd been friends since college, and she'd witnessed the Patricia situation firsthand at our wedding, where my mother-in-law had helpfully rearranged all the table settings an hour before the ceremony. You won't believe what Mark's cousin Lisa told me, Jen said, leaning in conspiratorially. She heard from Jenny, who heard from Bill, that Patricia is telling everyone you're starving, Mark. I nearly choked on my latte. She's what? Apparently, she's showing people a photo of Mark from your honeymoon, where he looks supposedly gaunt, claiming your experimental cooking is making him sick and malnourished. I was stunned. This was a new low, even for Patricia. That's insane, I sputtered. Mark weighs exactly the same as when we got married. If anything, He's gained a few pounds because we eat out more often now. Jen nodded sympathetically. Lisa thought it sounded fishy too. But Patricia is apparently very convincing. She even took some food to Mark's office last week. Told his coworkers she was worried about him not getting proper nutrition at home. So that's what Mark had been hiding. His mother had humiliated him at his workplace, suggesting his wife couldn't feed him properly. When I confronted Mark that evening, he finally admitted the truth. "I didn't want to upset you," he said, looking miserable. "She just showed up with all this food, telling everyone I looked thin and needed building up. It was embarrassing." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd be hurt. And because—" He hesitated. "Because what?" "Because part of me was afraid you'd confront her, and it would make things even worse," he admitted. He wasn't wrong. I was already planning exactly what I would say to Patricia. But his words made me pause. Confronting her directly had never worked. If anything, it gave her ammunition to paint me as the unreasonable one. I needed a different approach. The next day, I called Bill again. "I need your honest opinion," I said after explaining what Patricia was doing. "Is there any way to make her stop?" Bill was silent for a long moment. "Patricia is complicated," he finally said. "The more directly you oppose her, the more determined she becomes." "So what do I do?" "Just let her tell everyone I'm a terrible wife who can't cook." "No," Bill said thoughtfully. "What you need is to beat her at her own game." That conversation with Bill was the beginning of what I now think of as the plan. It wasn't elaborate or particularly devious. It was simply about exposing Patricia's behavior in a way she couldn't deny or explain away. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. Patricia's birthday was approaching, and despite everything, Mark wanted to do something special for her. "We could take her and Dad out to dinner," he suggested. "Actually," I said, an idea forming, "why don't we host a dinner party here, for all the family, your sister and her husband, your cousins, everyone Patricia's been talking to about my cooking?" Mark looked surprised. "Are you sure?" "After everything that's happened?" "Absolutely," I said with more confidence than I felt. "It's time to clear the air." What I didn't tell Mark was that I'd already spoken to Jenny's husband, who had endured years of Patricia's criticism. He confirmed everything Bill had said. Patricia had done the exact same thing to him, including telling family members he wasn't providing properly for Jenny. "Nothing I cooked or did was ever good enough," he'd told me, sounding weary even after all these years. Eventually, I just gave up trying to please her. "Did you ever confront her directly?" I asked. "Once," he said. "In front of everyone at a family gathering. She cried, made me look like the villain, and then went right back to her old behavior once the dust settled." His experience confirmed what I already suspected. Direct confrontation wouldn't work with Patricia. I needed to be smarter. The dinner party was set for the following Saturday. I spent the week planning the perfect menu, not too exotic to give Patricia ammunition, but special enough to impress. I decided on a crown roast, Patricia's favorite, with all the traditional sides she approved of. Everything would be impeccable. But the centerpiece of my plan wasn't the food. It was what would happen when Patricia inevitably tried to undermine me. The day before the party, Mark's cousin Lisa called. "Just a heads up," she said. "Patricia asked me what you were serving tomorrow, and when I told her about the crown roast, she said she'd bring her own, just in case. Something about yours probably being too rare for most people's tastes." Exactly as I'd anticipated. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, smiling to myself. "Actually, could you do me a favor? When you see Patricia tomorrow, could you ask her about the cooking classes she's supposedly been giving me? She's been telling everyone she's teaching me to cook, and I'd love to see her explain that one. Lisa laughed. Oh, this is going to be good. Consider it done. By the time Saturday arrived, I had enlisted several family members as unwitting accomplices in my plan. All I needed was for Patricia to behave exactly as she always did, and I had no doubt she would. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown. Patricia had no idea that this time, her tactics would be laid bare for everyone to see. And the best part? I wouldn't have to say a word. She would expose herself. As I prepared for the party, I felt a strange sense of calm. Win or lose after tonight, things would never be the same between Patricia and me. For better or worse, the truth would finally come out. The morning of Patricia's birthday dinner, I woke up early, my mind already racing with everything that needed to be done. Mark offered to help, but I gently declined. This is something I need to do myself, I told him. Why don't you pick up the wine and the flowers for your mom? Once he was gone, I began my preparations in earnest. The crown roast needed to be picked up from the specialty butcher across town. The potatoes needed to be peeled, the vegetables prepped, the dessert, a classic chocolate mousse cake, another of Patricia's favorites, needed to be assembled. But first, I set up my phone on the kitchen counter, positioned carefully to capture the entire room. I started recording video, then tucked the phone behind a cookbook stand where it wouldn't be noticed. This was my insurance policy, my way of capturing whatever Patricia might do when she thought no one was watching. As I worked, I thought about my conversation with Bill earlier that week. After our initial talk, he'd called me back with additional advice. The key to handling Patricia, he'd said, sounding tired from years of experience, is to anticipate her moves. She's predictable in her unpredictability, if that makes sense. It did make sense. Patricia always found a way to undermine me, especially when it came to cooking. So what would she do at a dinner party specifically designed to showcase my abilities? The answer was obvious. She would bring her own food, as Lisa had confirmed. But I suspected she might go further, perhaps tampering with my dishes when no one was looking, or trying to take over the kitchen entirely. The other thing to remember, Bill had added hesitantly, is that Patricia hates to look bad in front of others. She values her reputation as the perfect mother and homemaker above almost everything else. That was the key insight that had inspired my plan. If Patricia was going to be exposed, it had to happen publicly, in a way she couldn't deny or explain away. And it had to happen through her own actions, not my accusations. By noon, the house was spotless, the table beautifully set with our best china and crystal. The crown roast was prepped and ready for the oven, the sides nearly finished, the dessert chilling in the refrigerator. Everything was perfectly timed to be ready, just as guests arrived at 6. Mark returned with the wine and flowers, looking impressed by my progress. "This looks amazing," he said, surveying the appetizers I'd arranged. "You've outdone yourself." I smiled, feeling a flutter of nerves. "I want it to be special, for your mom." He kissed me gratefully, having no idea of what I was really planning. At 4 o'clock, I took a quick break to call Jen, who had agreed to be my ally in the evening ahead. "Everything ready on your end?" she asked. "Almost," I replied. "Do you remember what to watch for?" "Absolutely. If Patricia tries to interfere with the food, I'll create a distraction. And I'll make sure to compliment your cooking repeatedly throughout the night." "Perfect," I said. "And remember, no matter what happens, act surprised." "Don't worry," Jen assured me. "I missed my calling as an actress." I had just put the finishing touches on the appetizer platter when the doorbell rang. It was only 5 o'clock. Guests weren't supposed to arrive for another hour, but I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Patricia stood on the porch, arms laden with shopping bags, Bill hovering apologetically behind her. "We're early!" she announced cheerfully, brushing past me into the house. "I thought you might need help setting up." "Everything's already set up," I said, stepping back to let them in. As you can see, Patricia surveyed the living room and dining room with a critical eye, clearly searching for something to criticize. Finding nothing, she headed straight for the kitchen. "Let's see what you're making," she said, lifting lids off pots and peering into the oven without asking permission. "Crown roast," I said, keeping my voice pleasant. "Your favorite?" "Oh," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "That's ambitious for someone at your skill level?" I bit back a retort. "I wanted to make something special for your birthday." Patricia nodded absently, still inspecting my kitchen. Then she turned to the shopping bags she'd brought in. "Well, I took the liberty of bringing a few things, just in case." She began unpacking containers: a ham, mashed potatoes, green beans, and an apple pie. An entire backup meal. "That wasn't necessary," I said mildly. "As you can see, I have everything under control." "Better safe than sorry," she replied, opening my refrigerator without asking and rearranging things to make room for her dishes. "You never know how these things will turn out." Bill gave me an apologetic look. I smiled back, letting him know it was okay. Everything was going exactly as I had anticipated. As Patricia continued unpacking her backup dinner, I secretly checked my phone to make sure it was still recording. The red light blinked reassuringly. Whatever happened next would be captured for posterity. "I'll just put my potatoes on the stove to warm up," Patricia announced, reaching for one of my burners. "Actually," I said firmly, "I need all 4 burners for my sides. Your food will have to stay as is." Patricia looked taken aback by my assertiveness. "Well, I suppose they can be served room temperature, though it's not ideal." For the next hour, I continued my preparations while Patricia hovered, making small, helpful comments about my technique. "That's a bit too much salt," or "You might want to stir that more frequently," or "Are you sure the oven is at the right temperature?" I ignored her, focusing on making everything perfect. The crown roast went into the oven at precisely the right time. The potatoes were boiling, the vegetables steaming, the gravy simmering. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. The guests had arrived. Mark greeted his sister and her husband, his cousins, and a few close family friends while I put the finishing touches on the appetizers. Jen arrived last, giving me a subtle wink as she handed over a bottle of wine. As everyone gathered in the living room, Patricia made a point of announcing to the assembled family, "Sarah insisted on cooking tonight, even though I offered to handle everything. Let's hope it all turns out all right." Several family members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mark's cousin Lisa caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. I just smiled. The first part of the evening went smoothly. The appetizers were a hit. The conversation flowed, and even Patricia seemed to be behaving herself, though she made a point of mentioning, within earshot of several guests, that the stuffed mushrooms were a bit underdone. But I knew this was just the calm before the storm. The real test would come when I served the main course. As I excused myself to check on the crown roast, I felt Patricia's eyes following me. Sure enough, moments later she appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Let me help you serve," she offered, though it wasn't really an offer. "That's all right," I said. "I've got it under control." "I insist," she said, moving toward the oven. "A crown roast can be tricky to get right." As she reached for the oven door, I stepped back, pretending to give her space. In reality, I was making sure everything would be visible to my hidden phone camera. The stage was set. Now all I had to do was wait for Patricia to make her move. Patricia opened the oven door and peered critically at my crown roast. The aroma that filled the kitchen was mouth-watering. Perfectly seasoned meat, herbs, and garlic. It looked magazine-worthy, golden brown and succulent. Was all she said, her face impossible to read. I watched carefully as she picked up a meat thermometer from the counter, my meat thermometer, and inserted it into the roast without asking. "It's not quite done," she announced, though I could see the thermometer reading was perfect. "It needs at least another 20 minutes. Undercooked pork can be dangerous." "It's exactly the right temperature," I replied calmly. "I've been monitoring it carefully." Patricia shook her head. "Trust me, I've been cooking crown roasts since before you were born. This needs more time." She made to close the oven door, but I stopped her. "The roast is perfect as it is. If it cooks any longer, it will dry out." We stood at an impasse, both of us with our hands on the oven door, when Mark walked in. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, looking between us. "Your mother thinks the roast needs more cooking time." "I disagree." Mark looked uncomfortable. "Well, Mom does have a lot of experience with roasts." I felt a flash of betrayal, but quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the moment to create conflict with Mark. I had a larger plan. "You know what?" "You're right," I said, stepping back from the oven with a smile. "Patricia has much more experience than I do. Let's leave it in for another 20 minutes, as she suggests." Patricia looked triumphant, while Mark appeared relieved that a confrontation had been avoided. "I'll let everyone know dinner will be a bit delayed," he said, heading back to the living room. Once he was gone, I turned to Patricia. "Would you mind checking on the sides while I tidy up a bit? The potatoes might need stirring." She nodded, pleased to be given authority in my kitchen. "Of course, I'm happy to help." As soon as Patricia's back was turned, I quickly removed my phone from its hiding place, stopped the recording, and slipped it into my pocket. Then I busied myself rearranging the dessert plates, keeping one eye on Patricia. She stirred the potatoes, then the gravy, adding a bit more salt to both without asking. Then she glanced over her shoulder to see if I was watching. Thinking I wasn't, she reached into her purse, which she'd left on the counter, and pulled out a small container. My heart raced. Was she actually going to tamper with my food? With another furtive glance in my direction, Patricia quickly sprinkled something into the gravy, then stirred it vigorously. "What did you just put in my gravy?" I asked, making her jump. "Just a bit of my special seasoning," she said smoothly. "It needed a boost." "I didn't ask you to add anything." She waved dismissively. "You'll thank me. It was a bit bland." Before I could respond, Jen appeared in the doorway. "Need any help in here? Everyone's getting hungry." Her timing was perfect. I caught her eye and gave a slight nod. "Actually, yes," I said. "Could you take these appetizer refills out? And Patricia, would you mind bringing out your special ham? I think we should give guests something to nibble on while we wait for the roast." Patricia hesitated. The ham was supposed to be her backup plan, not part of the regular meal. But with Jen watching, she couldn't refuse without revealing her intentions. "Of course," she said stiffly. Once they both left the kitchen, I quickly checked the gravy. Whatever Patricia had added had dissolved, and I couldn't tell what it was by looking. It could have been simple seasoning, as she claimed, or something meant to ruin the dish. Either way, I wasn't taking chances. I poured it into a container and hid it in the back of the refrigerator, then quickly made fresh gravy from the extra drippings I'd set aside, a precaution I'd taken knowing Patricia might try something like this. 20 minutes later, the overcooked roast came out of the oven. As I'd feared, it was now well done throughout, the juiciness diminished. But it wasn't ruined. The quality of the meat and my careful preparation meant it was still delicious, just not perfect. As everyone gathered at the table, I served the roast alongside my perfectly prepared sides and, to Patricia's visible dismay, her ham, which I'd arranged on a platter as if it had been part of the planned menu all along. "Sarah insisted we serve Mom's ham as well," Mark announced, thinking he was complimenting both of us. 2 main courses. We're really celebrating tonight. Patricia's face tightened, but she could hardly object. Her backup plan had been incorporated into the meal, robbing her of the opportunity to present it as a rescue when my food, inevitably, failed. As the plates were passed around, I noticed Patricia watching anxiously as guests tried my roast. To her obvious disappointment, everyone raved about it, despite its slightly overcooked state. "This is incredible, Sarah," Mark's cousin Lisa exclaimed. "You'll have to give me the recipe." "It's perfectly seasoned," Jenny's husband added, giving me a knowing look. "Some of the best I've ever had." Patricia cut in quickly. "It's a bit dry though, isn't it? Good thing I brought the ham as backup." The table fell silent at her transparent attempt to criticize my cooking. Even Mark looked embarrassed. "Actually, Mom," he said, "I think the roast is delicious. Sarah did an amazing job." It was the first time he'd openly contradicted his mother about my cooking, and I felt a surge of gratitude. Patricia's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but Lisa spoke first. "Sarah, Patricia mentioned she's been giving you cooking lessons. I'd love to hear about that. What has she taught you?" I suppressed a smile. Lisa was playing her part perfectly. "Cooking lessons," I repeated innocently. "I'm not sure what you mean. Patricia and I have never cooked together." All eyes turned to Patricia, who looked caught off guard. "Well, not formal lessons," she backpedaled. "Just a few pointers here and there." "Really? Because you told me Sarah was completely hopeless in the kitchen until you took her under your wing," Lisa pressed. "You said you've been teaching her all of Mark's favorite recipes." Patricia's face grew redder. "I may have exaggerated a bit." "And what about the special diet you said Mark needed?" Jenny's husband chimed in. "You mentioned Sarah's cooking was making him ill." Mark's head snapped up. "What? Mom, did you really say that?" The dinner table had become a courtroom, with Patricia in the defendant's chair. Every lie, every manipulation she had spread among family members was being brought to light. Patricia looked around desperately, seeking an ally, but found none. Even Bill was shaking his head in disappointment. "I might have expressed some concerns," she said weakly. "A mother worries." "Well, I've never been healthier," Mark stated firmly. "Sarah's cooking is fantastic, and I'm lucky to have a wife who puts so much effort into making delicious meals for us." As the conversation moved on, Patricia sat in stunned silence, picking at her food. Her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The rest of the dinner passed without incident. Patricia barely spoke, which was a welcome change. By the time dessert was served, my chocolate mousse cake, which even Patricia couldn't find fault with, the atmosphere had lightened considerably. As guests began to leave, each complimented me on the wonderful meal. Many made a point of doing so within Patricia's hearing, as if they too had grown tired of her campaign against me. When only Mark's immediate family remained, Patricia finally spoke up. "The dinner was adequate," she said, unable to bring herself to offer a genuine compliment. "Though next time you might want to consult me on the menu beforehand." It was as close to a concession as I was likely to get. But the battle wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. After everyone else had left, Mark, his parents, and I sat in the living room with coffee. The tension was palpable. Patricia stared into her cup. Bill looked uncomfortable, and Mark kept glancing between his mother and me as if waiting for a bomb to explode. "I think it's time we cleared the air," I finally said, breaking the silence. Patricia looked up, her expression guarded. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." I pulled out my phone and placed it on the coffee table between us. "Patricia, I know you've been sabotaging my cooking since day one. I know you've been spreading rumors about me starving Mark. And tonight, I caught it all on video." Her face paled. Video? I nodded. My phone was recording in the kitchen. It caught you tampering with my gravy, lying about the temperature of the roast, and trying to take over my kitchen. That's ridiculous, she sputtered. I was helping. Let's watch it, shall we? I suggested, picking up my phone. That won't be necessary, Bill cut in, surprising all of us. Patricia, this has gone far enough. You need to apologize to Sarah. Patricia looked at her husband in shock. Apologize? For what? For trying to make sure our son is properly fed? For interfering where you weren't wanted, Bill said firmly. For undermining Sarah at every turn. For spreading lies about her cooking. They weren't lies, Patricia insisted. Mark was losing weight. Mark shook his head. No, Mom, I wasn't. I've actually gained 5 pounds since the wedding. Sarah's cooking is excellent, and you know it. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, real ones this time, not the calculated tears she'd used so often to manipulate situations. I just wanted to help, she said weakly. No, I said gently. You wanted to control. There's a difference. She opened her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could speak. Patricia, I've spent 2 years trying to win your approval. I've smiled through your criticism, pretended not to notice when you threw away my food, even let you take over my kitchen. But tonight made me realize something important. Your approval isn't worth the price of my self-respect. The room fell silent. Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it supportively. I've always been a good cook, I continued. My food has always been delicious. The problem was never my cooking. It was that you couldn't bear the thought of another woman feeding your son. Patricia looked stricken. For once, she had no ready denial, no counterattack. Is that true? Mark asked her quietly. Has this all been because you're jealous of Sarah's place in my life? Patricia's composure finally cracked. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice breaking. For 28 years, I was the woman in your life. I took care of you, cooked for you, made sure you had everything you needed. And then suddenly this stranger comes along and takes my place. Sarah didn't take your place, Mom, Mark said gently. She made her own place in my life. There's room for both of you. Not in the kitchen, there isn't, Patricia muttered. Despite everything, I found myself feeling a twinge of sympathy for her. Patricia's identity was so wrapped up in being needed by her son that my presence threatened her sense of self. You're right, I said, surprising everyone, including myself. There isn't room for both of us in the kitchen, my kitchen. But there is room for both of us in Mark's life, if you can accept that things have changed. Bill put his arm around Patricia's shoulders. It's time to let go, Pat. Mark has his own life now, his own home. We need to respect that. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I suppose I may have been a bit overbearing. Coming from Patricia, this was the equivalent of a full confession. So, what happens now? Mark asked, looking between his mother and me. I took a deep breath. First, Patricia agrees to stop spreading rumors about my cooking. Second, no more surprise visits. You call before coming over, like any normal person would. Third, when you are invited for dinner, you eat what's served without comment, or you politely decline the invitation. Patricia looked as if she wanted to argue, but Bill squeezed her shoulder. Those sound like reasonable boundaries, he said firmly. After a moment, Patricia nodded reluctantly. Fine, if that's what it takes for peace in the family. It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but it was progress. Rome wasn't built in a day, and Patricia wouldn't change overnight. But at least now, the rules were clear. The next morning, as Mark and I cleaned up the last of the dinner party mess, he pulled me into a hug. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening, he said. I should have stood up to her sooner. Better late than never, I replied, kissing him. As we finished putting away the dishes, the doorbell rang. We looked at each other in surprise. We weren't expecting anyone. Mark opened the door to find Patricia standing on the porch, holding a Tupperware container. My heart sank. Had nothing changed? Mom, Mark said coolly. We didn't know you were coming over. Patricia had the grace to look embarrassed. I know I should have called first. I wanted to bring this over before I lost my nerve. She handed the container to Mark, who opened it cautiously. Inside was a piece of paper. It's my crown roast recipe, Patricia explained. The one my mother taught me. I thought perhaps Sarah might like to have it. I stepped forward, unable to hide my surprise. Your family recipe? The one you've always refused to share? Patricia nodded stiffly. It seemed appropriate. After all, you're family now. It was a small gesture, but from Patricia, it was revolutionary. In her world, family recipes were sacred, passed down only to those deemed worthy. By giving me this recipe, she was acknowledging my place in the family in the only way she knew how. Thank you, I said sincerely. That means a lot to me. Well, she said, already backing toward the door, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional moment. I should go. Bill is waiting in the car. After she left, Mark and I stood looking at the recipe card. Do you think this means she's finally accepting you? Mark asked. I think it means she's trying, I replied. And right now, that's enough. I placed the recipe card on the refrigerator with a magnet. It wasn't a complete victory, and I had no illusions that Patricia had undergone a total transformation. There would still be comments, still be moments of tension, but the open warfare was over. The following Sunday, we were invited to dinner at Patricia and Bill's. When we arrived, I brought a dessert, a chocolate mousse cake, the same one from the birthday dinner. Patricia accepted it graciously. It looks lovely, she said, and though it clearly cost her effort, she added, Your cake was delicious last week. As we sat down to dinner, Patricia's cooking, which was admittedly excellent, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't even about the food, really. It was about respect. For the first time since I'd met her, Patricia was treating me with a modicum of respect. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't warmth, but it was a start. And as I took my first bite of Patricia's crown roast, prepared using the very recipe she'd given me, I savored not just the food, but the sweet taste of victory. Not because I'd defeated my mother-in-law, but because I'd stood up for myself and earned her respect in the process. Sometimes that's the sweetest revenge of all.